Our scripture today comes first from the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And then from John 15, verse 13. Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be unto God. The KGB was the instrument of oppression in the old Soviet Union before it fell. They were, of course, the secret police that arrested people for speaking out or doing anything against the system whatsoever. But there was an old joke in the Soviet Union. People joked about things, even under their breaths to one another, that were really, in real life, very dangerous things in order to survive those things. And the joke said that in a small town, the local KGB office had burned down. But part of the office and the telephone were still there, and so somebody was answering the phone. And the phone rang, and the lady answering the phone answered it and said, the KGB office has burned down. We can't do anything. And the man on the other end said, okay, and hung up. Well, a few minutes later, the man called back, and the woman said, the KGB office has burned down. We can't do anything. And the man said, okay, again, and hung up. But he did this several times over the next hour to finally the woman lost her patience and said, I have told you over and over that the KGB office burned down and we can't do anything. And the man said, yes, I know. I just like to hear you say it. The old Soviet Union was certainly an oppressive state, with true freedoms, as we know them, certainly severely restricted. Yet it's interesting, if you read the Constitution of the old Soviet Union, it says that the people of the old Soviet Union were supposed to have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. However, if you were trying to do any of those in any way that was not approved by the state, then the KGB would certainly come and see you. Certainly people had no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, and no freedom of assembly. The Constitution of Communist China today also promises these same freedoms, freedom of speech, of assembly, of association, of demonstration, but these ring hollow. Particularly when you remember the film of the man standing in front of the tanks. You remember the film, the man with the briefcase, and the tank would try to turn, and he would step in front of it. Those tanks were on their way to crush demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. And even now today, Christian leaders are routinely arrested for speaking up about their faith in China. So those freedoms do not exist there, despite what their constitution says. The Constitution of Iran promises freedom of belief, but if you dare speak up in your belief, let's say in Jesus Christ, and if you speak up about anything outside of approved venues, then it's off to the infamous Evin prison for you. In fact, most of the constitutions in most of the countries of the world make these same promises. The freedoms we find enumerated in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States: freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government to change its way of doing things. But in truth, precious few are the countries that actually follow through with any of these freedoms. Even countries that we consider Western democracies, some of our closest allies, do not have as wide a set of liberties as we have here in the United States. Freedom of speech and expression, for instance, are restricted in multiple ways, even in places we consider democracies. They cannot say things or print things that we could say or print here. The question I want to talk about this morning is, what is the difference between countries like China and Iran, where those freedoms are promised, but everyone knows that those promises are not real or true? And what's the difference between them and the United States, where those same freedoms are promised, but those freedoms are true and real and held to be sacred? The better question, I guess, of what the difference is What makes the difference between the two? What makes the difference between a country that promises these things but sure doesn't give them, and a country like the United States where we are promised these freedoms and we have them? It is my opinion that what makes the difference between the promises written on paper but empty in reality and the promises written in our Constitution, which are taken seriously, are the men and women who have been willing to give their lives that we might have and might keep those freedoms here in the United States. The men and women who we remember this weekend, and especially on Memorial Day. Men and women who gave their all, their whole lives, their futures, so that the freedoms we cherish might remain real and not just empty words on a page. More than 1 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen have given their lives in all of America's wars. More than 1 million. That's a huge number, especially if you remember that every one of those 1 million were individuals. People with lives and hopes and dreams and families and friends and loved ones who cared about them and who loved them. Think of the loss of these individuals on each of their families and on each of their communities. Think of the children not born because these people's lives were cut short. Of maybe some of the scientific breakthroughs were not made because they could not finish their studies and go on into a career where they may have found things that others have missed. Think of the poems not written, of the dreams left unfulfilled that could have reached out and touched all of our lives. Think of the lives cut short, most often in the very beginning of those lives. Those are the folks that we think most of on Memorial Day. Now, we have Veterans Day, and we celebrate that, and it remembers those who served and who still yet are living. And we also have Armed Forces Day, which honors those who are currently serving. But Memorial Day is particularly to remember those who were killed in the line of duty in the service of their country, who died most particularly and probably most of all for one another and their comrades in arms, but who also died for hearth and home, for families and loved ones, and for the freedoms that we cherish but all too often take for granted. We all can think of how those freedoms impact our lives on a daily basis. As a minister, I feel particularly aware of them. For every Sunday, I get up and stand before a congregation that has freely assembled together, and we worship as we feel called to by our God, and I stand up and preach and say what I wish, and none of us had to worry about the police or a group of soldiers coming to arrest us for having done so. When I was in the former Soviet Union, I met people who had been harassed and followed and informed upon and punished and even arrested and beaten for just trying to go to church and worship as we're doing today. I met people who had been beaten for carrying Bibles into their country. Others who had been the lucky ones, I guess. They weren't beaten or tortured, but they were exiled to other countries for teaching their Bible class in Sunday school, as we would call it, or for refusing to become informers on their fellow believers. Our freedoms are too great to be taken for granted because, in truth, what we remember this weekend especially is that those freedoms were not and are not free. They have come and they have been maintained at a high cost. The men and women who gave their lives in service of their country did not ask anything from us. But we can still honor them, and at least in a couple of ways I can think of. The first is to remember them, to not forget them, or that they gave everything they had, even their futures, so that we might have what we have. And the second way we can remember them is by not taking for granted the freedoms we have that they won and kept for us. We can honor them by living out those freedoms in our daily lives, by living the dreams that we have, and by striving to be all that we're called to be, and enjoying and using the freedoms of speech and religion and press and assembly and the right to change our government's policies. When it was up to them, they stood and did what was necessary. Now these things are up to us to keep them and to so live as to pass them on to the next generation, and train them up so that they will be willing and able to pass them on to the next generation, and they to the next, and they to the next. I'm not much given to civil religion. That's the conflating of faith and nation. It can lead to the abuse of both of those things. But I enjoy the freedom we have, and I will never forget those who made that freedom possible by paying the ultimate price. May they rest in peace in God's arms, and may their memories be honored, for they have made the difference in our lives of freedom.